Welcome back to the Hotcast. We like to do these deep dives.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be looking at the ongoing war in Ukraine.
Okay.
We've got a couple of news articles from BBC and Reuters
Okay.
and an opinion piece from the National Post.
All right.
And let me tell you, they paint a pretty complex picture of what's happening over there and how the U.S. is kind of navigating this whole situation.
It's fascinating, right? How these sources, while focusing on different things, all kind of come together on this central theme
Yeah.
of uncertainty.
Uncertainty.
Uncertainty about when the war is going to end, uncertainty about U.S. commitment to its allies, and really uncertainty about the future of global power dynamics, how everything is shifting and changing.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little.
Yeah.
And we could start with Frank Gardner's BBC article.
Okay.
It really dives into J.D. Vance's, the U.S. Vice President,
Right.
appearance at the Munich Security Conference. And it sounds like his speech wasn't exactly what people were expecting.
Yeah.
Right.
Instead of, zeroing in on the war in Ukraine or, even European defense, Vance kind of took it as a moment to critique U.S. allies. Specifically, he accused European leaders of stifling free speech and then not doing enough to control immigration, which, raised a few eyebrows at a conference that was supposed to be focusing on security, specifically security concerns related to the war.
So what do you make of his decision to focus on these issues? I mean, it seems kind of out of place given the context of the conference.
Well, it's possible, right? It's possible that Vance was trying to appeal to a certain group of his supporters back home, back in the U.S.
Right.
These issues, free speech and immigration, those are hot-button topics that really resonate with a lot of voters.
Yeah.
And, by talking about these on this huge international stage, it's kind of like Vance is sending a signal to those voters.
Yeah.
Saying, hey, I'm aligned with you. I hear your concerns.
That's a very interesting point. And Gardner actually mentions in his article that Vance's comments didn't land well with the audience.
Right.
He even talks about a joke that Vance made that just completely fell flat.
It's almost like that awkward silence spoke volumes,
Yeah.
About the disconnect between what Vance was saying and what those European leaders were thinking about. Like, their priorities were not really being addressed.
It almost suggests that those domestic issues were kind of at odds with what those allies are facing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Now, Gardner also highlights Zelensky's perspective.
Yeah.
But amidst all of this, he's trying to stay optimistic,
Right.
emphasizing the importance of continued dialogue with the U.S. Sounds like a tough balancing act for him.
It is. It really is. I mean, Zelensky, he needs the U.S.'s support, both militarily and diplomatically, if he's going to counter Russia.
Yeah.
But he also has to face reality. The reality is that the U.S. might be willing to make concessions to Russia that are simply unacceptable to Ukraine. So it's very delicate, right? He needs to keep a good relationship with the U.S., but also protect Ukraine's interests at the same time.
And this is where things get more complex, right? Because Gardner points out that the U.S. has undermined Ukraine's negotiating position by saying that restoring their pre-2014 borders is not realistic. What are the implications of that statement, and how might that affect Zelensky's strategy?
I mean, think about it. By saying publicly that some of Ukraine's goals are just not realistic, the U.S. is kind of limiting Zelensky's options, right?
Yeah.
It's limiting his leverage in peace talks, if they ever happen. This could create some distrust between Ukraine and the U.S. And I think maybe even more importantly, it could embolden Putin, make him less willing to compromise.
It's a tangled web, that's for sure. And speaking of emboldening Putin, there's this fear in the BBC article that Putin might just come out of this on top.
Right.
And use that to seize even more territory in Europe.
Which is a huge concern, and I think it goes back to Vance's criticisms of European leaders. If the U.S. is out there publicly criticizing its allies, it could give justification for Russia's future actions.
Okay.
Almost like Putin could say, look, I'm just protecting these people who feel marginalized by Europe.
Yeah.
It creates this really dangerous narrative.
Right.
That could make things a whole lot worse.
It's a chilling thought, and it actually brings us to Mark Norman's opinion piece in the National Post. He argues that Canada's relationship with the U.S. is beyond saving at this point, and that Canada needs to just act accordingly because they're under attack.
Wow, that's a really strong statement. I think it highlights this ripple effect, how the U.S.'s actions in Ukraine could really impact its relationship with allies.
So how do we put all these pieces together?
Yeah.
We've got Vance's appeal to his base, we've got Zelensky's balancing act, and this fear that Putin might just become even more ambiguous. It all seems connected.
It's all related, yeah, and it raises questions about the future of the U.S. in the world and how stable things are going to be. If you're interested in exploring this war, and I know you are, You should definitely check out the Hotcasts YouTube channel. We've got tons of great content that can help you really understand the complexities of what we're talking about. International relations, geopolitics.
I second that.
What I find really intriguing is how Vance's actions fit into what we know about international relations.
Okay.
For example, you know how realists think.
Yeah.
They might say that his focus on domestic issues, it's just being pragmatic. It's about protecting U.S. power.
So break that down for me a little. What does realism mean in this context?
Okay, so realism in international relations, it's this idea that countries should always look out for themselves first, put their own interests and power above everything else.
Okay.
Realists believe that countries are always trying to survive, and that any cooperation, it's temporary, you can't rely on it.
So you're saying Vance's actions are kind of like what a realist would do.
It's one way to look at it.
He's putting America first, even if it hurts relationships with allies.
Yeah, now, of course, there are other ways of looking at it, like liberalism, which is all about cooperation and international institutions. That's totally different.
Right.
But when you look at Vance's speech, focusing on those domestic issues and criticizing allies, it kind of leans towards that realist view,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. So this adds another layer to it. We've got these theoretical frameworks to help us understand different approaches to foreign policy, and it seems like Vance might be shifting towards something more realist, or even isolationist.
Right, and that shift could really impact U.S. alliances and the whole global order. What if the U.S. steps back from its role as this, guarantor of security and stability
Yeah.
that could create this void that China or Russia could jump into?
This is getting really fascinating. We need to be aware of all these perspectives, the historical context, and what could happen because of all of this.
Yeah, and that's why things like the Hotcast are so important.
Right.
We're trying to make this analysis accessible, give people the information they need to engage with these complicated topics.
Well said. So now let's get back to the sources. The Reuters article goes deeper into Vance's accusations towards European leaders,
Right.
specifically their approach to free speech and immigration.
Which, again, might resonate with some people back home for Vance, but it seems jarring
Right.
when you think about the anxieties around Putin.
Yeah.
Everyone is worried that he's going to come out of this stronger and try to expand even more into Europe.
So how do these two things connect? Vance's criticisms and the fear of Putin.
It's a subtle thing. By criticizing Europe, Vance might be giving Putin a story to justify what he does next.
Okay.
Like, Putin could say he's just defending those people who feel sidelined by European policies.
Right.
You know?
Right. That's disturbing.
It is. It shows how what seems like a domestic political move can really impact things globally. It's like a chain reaction. You do something for your voter at home, and it ends up having unforeseen consequences on the international stage.
Exactly. We can't view these things in isolation.
No,
Everything's connected.
it is, and that's why we have to analyze these things through a geopolitical lens. We have to look at the bigger picture, see how everything fits together, what could happen down the line.
This is getting really fascinating. We're going to be right back after a quick break to delve even deeper into the consequences of the U.S.'s stance on this war and what it might mean for the future.
Can't wait. It's like a big game of chess, Each move could change everything.
And what about Zelensky? How does he deal with all of this? It's got to be a really tough spot for him.
Zelensky's walking a tightrope. He needs the U.S., but he also has to be ready for the possibility that they'll make a deal with Russia that Ukraine just can't accept.
So he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't.
Yeah, pretty much. He needs to be smart, make people believe in him, keep his country together, all while everyone's pressuring him.
Gardner's article mentions that he's trying to stay positive and that he wants to keep talking to the U.S. Is that even realistic right now?
It has to be. Keeping those lines of communication open is the only way to avoid misunderstandings and maybe find some way to work together. But being optimistic isn't enough. Zelensky needs to know the U.S. is with him, and he needs to be ready if they decide to put their own needs first.
That's kind of scary to think about. And it brings us back to Putin, right? That fear that he might actually win and then decide to take even more of Europe. How likely is that?
It's definitely a possibility. We've seen that he's not afraid to use force, and if he thinks the West is divided, he might take advantage of that.
So what can we do to stop that from happening?
The U.S. needs to show its allies, especially in Europe, that they can count on them. Maybe by sending more troops to Eastern Europe, giving more help to Ukraine, and hitting Russia with harder sanctions.
But didn't you say that Vance criticizing European leaders could actually help Putin?
Yeah, that's why it's important for the U.S. to be clear and consistent. It's fine to have issues with allies, but talking about them publicly now when everyone needs to be on the same page just gives Putin ammunition. It could hurt the effort to stop Russia.
So it seems like the U.S. is stuck. How do they keep everyone together while still looking out for themselves?
It's a tough balancing act. They need to talk to their allies privately and work things out, but at the same time show a strong and unified front against Russia. They need to talk and be willing to compromise.
This is getting really big. What does this all mean for the future of things like international relations? The whole world order, really.
That's the big question, isn't it? If the U.S. keeps going down this path where it's only looking out for itself and ignoring what the rest of the world thinks, it could really change things. We might see more dictators, fewer human rights, and more wars breaking out everywhere.
That's a pretty bleak picture. And then you've got Mark Norman's article where he's saying that Canada needs to think about itself and maybe distance itself from the U.S. Are other U.S. allies going to start thinking the same way?
It's possible. If countries start to see the U.S. as unreliable, they might not want to work together on things like defense or trade. That could make the world a lot more chaotic and dangerous, with every country just looking out for itself.
So it sounds like we're at a turning point. What world leaders do in the next few months or years could change everything.
Exactly. This is a huge moment in history, and we all need to pay attention and get involved. We need to make sure our leaders do the right thing, push for peace and cooperation, and work together to make the world a better place. And speaking of staying informed, have you checked out the Hotcast's YouTube channel? It's a great place to learn about all these complicated issues. They have really good videos on geopolitics, international relations, and all sorts of other stuff that can help you understand what's going on in the world.
It's definitely a great resource, especially when things feel so uncertain and unpredictable.
I agree. The more we know about what's happening, the better we can deal with all these challenges.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. Vance at the conference, Zelensky's tough situation, and everyone worried about what Putin might do next. What happens now? What are some of the things that could happen? And what should we be watching out for in the next few weeks and months?
It really does feel like we're at a crossroads. Like any one of these paths could lead to a completely different outcome. What are some of the things that you think could happen?
Yeah, like what are the scenarios here? What are we looking at?
Well, one possibility is that the U.S. and its allies, they manage to get it together,
Okay.
present this united front. That could deter Russia, stop them from doing anything more. And maybe eventually they could even negotiate some kind of peace deal in Ukraine.
That would be the best case scenario, right? Everyone comes together, works things out. What are some of the other possibilities, though? What if it doesn't go that way?
The other side of the coin is that things between the U.S. and its allies, they keep getting worse.
Okay.
That would weaken their response to Russia, and it could embolden Putin, make him think he can get away with even more.
Yeah.
That could mean a really long conflict in Ukraine, and it could even spill over into other countries, increase the risk of a much bigger war.
That's definitely something we don't want. And you mentioned earlier how all of this could impact the world order, how the U.S.'s actions could have these ripple effects.
Yeah, absolutely. If the U.S. keeps putting itself first, ignoring its allies, and breaking international rules, it could really damage the whole system we've had since World War II.
Can you explain that a bit more? What is this liberal international order and why is it important?
Basically, it's the set of rules, institutions, and norms that have shaped how countries interact for decades. Things like free trade, democracy, human rights, and working together. The U.S. has been a big part of building and supporting this order, but lately its actions suggest they might be moving away from those principles.
So what happens if the U.S. steps back? Who fills that gap?
That's the scary part. Other powers like China or Russia might try to take over that leadership role.
Okay.
And that could lead to a world that's less stable, less cooperative, and more prone to conflict. International institutions like the UN would be weakened.
This is heavy stuff. It feels like we're at a really crucial point in history, and it's up to all of us to stay informed and engaged.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and watch this happen. We need to hold our leaders accountable, push for policies that support peace and cooperation, and support those working towards a more just and sustainable world.
It's easy to feel helpless in the face of all this, but we can make a difference, right? Even small actions can have an impact.
Absolutely. Every voice matters. We need to educate ourselves, have these conversations, and support organizations that are working to make things better. That's how we build a better future.
Well said. And speaking of resources, I want to mention the Hotcast's YouTube channel again. They have incredible content on geopolitics, international relations, and so many other fascinating topics. It's a great way to learn more about the complex world we live in.
I completely agree. It's a fantastic way to stay informed and make sense of everything that's happening.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key things you want listeners to take away from this conversation?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the situation in Ukraine is constantly changing, and there are no simple solutions.
Right.
Secondly, the U.S.'s actions will have a huge impact on global politics and the future of international relations. And lastly, we all need to stay informed and engaged now more than ever.
Those are important points. We can't just bury our heads in the sand and hope it all goes away.
Exactly. We have the power to make a difference through our choices, our actions, and our voices.
I love that. So on that note, this has been a fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Hotcast podcast.